All right. Hey, everybody. We're going to get started. Thank you for joining us for today's event, The Battle for the Global Internet. I am Dustin Phillips, Executive Director of ISOC DC, and we'd like to thank New America and Diplo Foundation for partnering with us and pulling this event together. And we'd like to thank the esteemed panel for leading the discussion. We are going to look at what the coming months might mean for Internet governance. The numerous processes happening over the next few months could be an inflection point for the way the Internet functions both at home and around the world. And we have a great panel of experts here to provide their perspectives, but we also have a lot of experts in the crowd. So we hope that today's event will be interactive with some time at the end for Q&A. Additionally, to contribute to the discussion both online, please use the hashtag Global Internet. And with that, I would like to turn it over to our moderator, Teresa Horosova, the Project Development Director for Diplo Foundation.
Thank you, Dustin, and thank you, everybody, for coming and making time. Welcome also to everybody following us online. Please be part of the conversation on Twitter, especially if following remotely. As Dustin said, we are using the hashtag Global Internet with capital G, capital I. And my colleague in the room can also pick up some points from the Twitter discussions to feed in to this event. As Dustin said, we should be looking at what is up for digital policy in the upcoming months. We are now at the end of September, and already up until now, this has been quite an eventful year with many kind of hot issues on the agenda. To name a few which might have defined this year in digital policy, we can mention the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica scandal and the kind of consequences of that. All the discussion about the general data protection regulation, discussions on the future of autonomous vehicles, or let's say discussions on taxing the internet economy, and ongoing on cybersecurity geopolitics. And really a lot more is to come in those 3 remaining months that we have still ahead of us. And we do believe that some of the new kind of, let's say, decisions or developments around digital policy really will be taking place at some of these global fora that are coming ahead. That's the plan for today. We will cover a few selected events which we have considered as being kind of crucial for developments. We probably will have omitted some, and we also might not, although in this very kind of well-represented panel, have the expertise to cover them all in all these aspects. So therefore, we also encourage you in the later part of this panel to draw on your expertise, and please do come in and enrich us and each other. We have some excellent speakers here to guide us through that. I will start on my left with just telling a few words about each of them, and let's start with Jovan. Jovan Kurbalia, who is here at his new capacity today as a co-chair of the Secretariat of the newly formed high-level panel on digital cooperation. This is a new initiative that has kind of, shaken up a little bit the discussions of digital policy, with quite some expectations coming out for it. It was directed to be established directly by the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. And the idea of the panel is to basically strengthen digital cooperation. We will hear from Jovan what it means practically and concretely. Jovan is the founding director of Diplo Foundation, the organization that I'm representing here. He's a former diplomat and author of a publication, Introduction to Internet Governance, which has already been translated to more than 10 languages and is currently in its 6th edition. Further, we have Becky Bohr. Becky Bohr is the Deputy General Counsel and Chief Privacy Officer at Neustar, where she oversees the various privacy by design initiatives of the company. And at the same time, Becky is on the board of directors of ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. As we have another important meeting of this organization coming up soon, that's what Becky will bring in. I will then continue with our friend and colleague Shane Hughes, who is the co-chair of the IGF USA, Internet Governance Forum USA. It is the national version of the Global Internet Governance Forum that Shane will be covering in this panel. At the same time, Shane is the visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she's managing the Global Internet Strategy Program. Not to mention that she's also president of Logan Circle Strategies, working with her clients to create coordinated public policy approach on various issues such as cybersecurity and ICTs on the global scale. And lastly, to have at least some more gender balance in this panel, we have Robert Morgos, who is from here at New America. He's the senior policy analyst at the Cybersecurity Initiative, which is the program that helped us put this event together. He's working on some very interesting research that, by the way, you can collect a copy of his recent study there at the entry if you haven't done that so. And he works on issues such as mechanisms to counter the spread of offensive cyber capability, cybersecurity and international governance, and also the Russian internet doctrine. So that's just to give you a little glimpse of who we have here today to share their reflections on the upcoming events with us. Jovan, first to you. This initiative, the high-level panel on digital cooperation, was announced around the summer. It is expected to work for a few months. And you had your first meeting of the full panel in New York just a few days ago. What can you tell us? What can we expect from this?
Thank you, Teresa. It's really great to be back at New America. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, colleagues and friends. I have a bit a difficult situation because everybody knows about ICANN and IGF, but I guess very few are aware of UN high-level panel. It's a really long title. Could you raise your hands? How many of you are aware of the activities and main aims? 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's not bad. Almost half of the room. Do you mind if I just give a few indications what the panel is about, and then reflect on the latest developments? It was established on the 12th of July by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, with the major aim to increase the level and address some pressing issues in digital field. The title was carefully chosen as digital cooperation in order to provide possibilities for the new and fresh approaches in this field. The panel consists of 22 members, 11 women, and it also has 4 people beyond 30, below 35. Therefore, it has the elements of the sort of a next generation of leaders. It is multi-stakeholder in its composition. It has representatives from governments, private sector, civil society, quite good distribution when it comes to the different continents and regions. It is co-chaired by Melinda Gates and Jack Ma. This is more or less the construct of the overall construct of the panel. What the Secretary General asked us at the very beginning of this process is to take humble, professional, and inclusive approach to discussion on digital cooperation. In the terms of reference, if you consult it, it is clearly indicated the panel should not propose establishment of new fora for the digital policy. The remits of the panel activities are quite clear. We think that there is a lot of space to improve existing organizations, to suggest new mechanisms within the existing organizations, and make digital policy and digital cooperation more inclusive and more effective. The panel had the first online meeting in mid-August, and it met on Monday and Tuesday in New York. And it was the discussion at the panel, this overall spirit of a discussion basically could be outlined around discussion on the principles of digital cooperation, survey of existing mechanisms of digital cooperation, and application of digital cooperation to specific fields like capacity development, like the overall question of data. And the panel will basically engage in public consultations over the next 4 months and have another meeting in January in Geneva at the end of January. The report should be ready by April, May, and then there will be some sort of dissemination phase for 2 or 3 months. The real question is what is digital cooperation? And this is, I'm trying to address the sort of big question marks in the room, which we are often asked. Digital cooperation exists really on different levels. It exists in local communities all over the world, in the way how for example, M-Pesa was developed and established in Africa. It exists also in the multi-stakeholder, intergovernmental, and other spaces. While the panel is not going to propose establishment of new fora, which was clearly indicated by the Secretary General, it will try to tackle questions of interdisciplinarity as one of the issues in dealing with digital policy issues. We are finding increasing number of silos, policy silos, which are making less inclusive and less optimal digital policy on national, regional, and global level. This is definitely going to be one of the aspects of digital cooperation which will be tackled by the panel. And for others, I will wait for questions and discussion and follow-up.
Thank you, Jovan. Thank you also for everybody. There will be on Monday, as I've understood, 2 update calls, virtual town hall meetings, where the community will be able to learn a bit more concretely what were the outcomes of this meeting. The one more convenient for this time zone will be happening, if I'm not mistaken, at 11 a.m. Eastern time. So I think if you go on the website of the panel, you can register for this meeting and then log in and learn even more. Thank you, and I'm sure that there will be some more questions later. From New York, where the first meeting of the HLP, because I'll be using a lot of acronyms, we are moving to Barcelona, to ICANN 63. This will be the meeting of the, as I've explained, Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which is basically the organizations that kind of provides the technical ways of how the DNS system run and also defines policies on the names and numbers on the internet. A lot of kind of buzz around ICANN has been around GDPR, another acronym, Global Data Protection Regulation, and the WHOIS database. Are these the topics that are expected to dominate this meeting, or what should we expect, Becky?
So first let me say that I am speaking on my own behalf and not speaking for the board or organization. It just makes it easier if I start out by saying that. But those of you who know me know that I will tell you what I think. Barcelona promises to be a very busy meeting. As you've noted, ICANN's compliance and compliance of the contracted parties, registries, and registrars with the European General Data Protection Regulation and how that fits into and can remain consistent with the provision of WHOIS data is probably topic number one. Mm-hmm. Right now, the expedited policy development process that is working on developing a policy around the temporary policy that the board put in place on an emergency basis in May is meeting face-to-face in Los Angeles, and there will be more meetings of both the community and the EPDP group in Barcelona, and many more coming up to that. That's a critically important issue. WHOIS has been in, WHOIS, which is, for anybody who doesn't know, the publicly available information about those who register domain names. And it's used by many, many stakeholders, law enforcement, intellectual property rights holders, businesses, and individuals to understand who has registered a name and to communicate with those people. And that's been within ICANN's wheelhouse since ICANN's creation 20 years ago. This is ICANN's 20th birthday, which is really hard to believe. There's some debate about what actual day it is, but we will be celebrating that in Barcelona as well. This is a huge issue, but it raises some ancillary issues that I think are critically front and center for ICANN. One is just the resiliency and scalability of the of the model and how you create incentives for stakeholders across the community to come together and get out of their corners and actually develop solutions. This is the EPDP is a test of that, and I think the GNSO, the Generic Name Supporting Organization Council, has noted concern about how the policy development processes work, whether we need to think about consensus in a different way. And so the council has issued something that they call PDP 3.0, Policy Development Process 3.0. The sort of continuing to evolve the processes by which ICANN makes decisions is very high up on the list of our agenda topics, because ICANN's multi-stakeholder model is really a critical piece of this, and unless it can actually get decisions made, that's an issue for it. There are other concerns about decision-making outside of the sort of traditional policy development context. We did this in the transition from the relationship between ICANN and the US government. We had these cross-community working groups. Those worked pretty well, but they did have this deadline and a consequence if a resolution wasn't reached. And so we're trying to think about what the lessons learned from that is and how we need to structure things. We have a couple of other policy development issues on the table, protections of acronyms for international organizations, things that are of significance to these groups but don't neatly fit into trademark or other sort of international legal regimes. So that's all of those issues will be on the agenda in Barcelona. And then ICANN is, of course, a big participant and supporter of the IGF. And so we'll be preparing for our participation in IGF in Paris in November.
Just a month after, approximately after the meeting in Barcelona. Before going to Shane, I will make a little divert to Robert, because between the IGF and ICANN, we will have another meeting that is absolutely crucial. The acronym I'll be using now is PP18, standing for the Plenipotentiary Conference of the ITU, of the International Telecommunications Union, which will be taking place in Dubai. And Robert, I know that you have followed the process, which, the preparation for the Plenipotentiary Conference takes months and months before this event, and it's really difficult to follow unless you're a real insider. But this meeting will decide on the next 4-year plan kind of for the organization. Tell us more. What can we expect?
Yeah, just really briefly, because I'm not actually from the ITU or involved necessarily in the Plenipot, but just in speaking with folks who are. Quickly on the ITU, for those who don't know, it's a UN agency, specialized agency that's been around for over a century that manages the allocation of global spectrum. It develops technical standards for telecom and provides capacity building to member states to both improve access to ICT and improve the nature of that access to ICT. They've played a big part in recent years in cybersecurity capacity building in particular. The Plenipot, as Teresa mentioned, happens every 4 years, and it's the forum in which member states set the ITU's sort of strategic direction, talk about finances, talk about leadership, amend what the organization's remit might be in some cases. Topics that are expected to be on the docket this upcoming year are a lot of the sort of technology buzzwords that you keep hearing. They're expecting blockchain to be something that comes up. They're expecting artificial intelligence and big data to be on the agenda because the last one happened 4 years ago. Next generation or fifth generation telecommunications infrastructure is also something that's expected to be sort of a hot topic. And then there are a couple of potential hot button issues particularly when we talk about sort of the global politics of internet governance. The first involves the question of whether or not there should be another WICIT, World Conference on International Telecommunications, which is the conference that happened in 2012 where folks who have been following the internet governance process for a while will remember there was a bit of a diplomatic impasse at the end on whether or not the ITU should update the international telecommunications regulations in order to give them more of a remit for regulating the global internet. And that leads to the second major hot button issue, and that is whether or not there will be an update to the remit of the ITU to include internet technologies within their sort of regulatory remit. Many in the developing world look to the ITU for guidance in navigating public policy challenges associated with every new digital technology. Parts of the world, including the likes of sort of Russia and China, often try to use the ITU as a means to consolidate or legitimize more state control over telecommunications technology. And still others like the UK, Australia, and traditionally the US view that latter bit as sort of mission creep for the ITU. So those are some of the dynamics that are going to be going on at the Plenty Pot, which, like Teresa said, starts in the end of October and sort of creeps into November.
It's basically a 2-week
Yeah.
event, so
3.
3 weeks, sorry. I've never been, I'm not an ITU member, so I can't. Yeah.
5 weeks and the board is even more.
Well,
What is the longest? Is radio telecommunications?
Well,
1 month.
Yeah, I think that they were all, I mean, as late as 1999, Plenty Pot was 5 weeks long.
but I'm sure there are some of you in the room who follow the PP18 preparation more intensely, so please jump in then. Still before the IGF, there is IETF 103, Internet Engineering Task Force meeting. Another example of a meeting that is quite impossible to follow if you're an outsider. It's basically a forum that kind of puts together people and creates technical and engineering documents that make the internet work better. Most of the work of this organization actually takes place in mailing lists long before the meeting. I was once fortunate to observe what the IETF meeting looks like, and really if you're just like parachuted to this meeting, it's really demanding. If there is anybody in the room or anybody from the Internet Society, which is of course very much involved in these meetings in the room, please jump in in a bit to tell us more. And finally, from Bangkok, where IETF meeting is happening, we are going to Paris. And that will certainly be one of the highlights of this year's event, the next meeting of the Internet Governance Forum. This year, it should be a bit different than the previous ones. Shane, what are your expectations?
So this one is very late in the planning process, which is a bit unusual. So we're still kind of catching up, and not all the workshops have been chosen yet. I'm not sure any of them have been, which is a bit odd. We know that in 2019 we're going to Germany, so in 2018 we're trying to make sure we make the best of the IGF there. It will be in Paris. Their key thing is openness and, sorry, what's my key word there? Trust. Sorry, it's the Internet of Trust, which I'm still trying to kind of figure out. I am the co-chair of IGF USA. We feed into this process, but we're not the only part of the process. So Teresa and Jovan are the conveners of Diplo runs the Eurodig, which I've been fortunate to attend, and they do a fantastic job in the way that they organize and have very good constructive dialogues at Eurodig. So we brought them in this year very early on in the IGF USA process to try to help facilitate more constructive dialogue at IGF USA. We actually use, we were talking about big data earlier, we use a little bit of small data, but good data. We start the group at IGF USA with a survey, and thank you, Steve Del Bianco, who did a lot of work for us in that area. And part of the challenge with a multi-stakeholder process is this one for us goes from kind of ICANN being macro to a little bit more micro, is hashing out everybody's intent and their hidden agendas, and the small data set that we take helps us guide into what we think are going to be the key areas of discussion that will be important in July. So we understand what it's like to do it on a small scale. I imagine how challenging this is to do it on a large scale. But a lot of key issues are smart cities, privacy, civil society is very engaged. We've had fake news panels for 2 years running. And we've done different things where we've had scenarios, and we've done that also at the international level, not just at the national level. One year we went to, actually, several of us were invited to IGF Russia several years ago to kind of do a scenario where you look at, what happens if we end up in a bifurcated internet system versus our current system. And they're good sessions to run people through because it makes them think forward into the processes and the policies they're putting forward. I want to let you all know right now that you're invited to participate in IGF USA, just to make sure I get this date right, July 27th? Do we set we're working on the contract right now. 25th, okay, at CSIS. It is, we go out of our way to be a very transparent, open, and public process. It's on Twitter, it's on Facebook, it has its own website, which is now igfusa.us. We're migrating. And it's a good way for us as American citizens to understand what we bring to the table. But when we learn so much when we go to the international forum, because we realize that there's a lot of struggles that are happening with people that are either not as connected as we are, or they may be having really interesting things that we should be emulating. We're seeing a lot in the mobile payment area coming out of Africa. And so the IGF USA is a really interesting place to have a cross-functional dialogue with groups. I found at the last one in Geneva, the best discussions were with the youth groups. You go to the youth forums, and they were having really interesting, forward-thinking processes. They weren't continuing to haggle over, old conventions that they think should be implemented onto the internet, and it was really refreshing. But this year, I think we will continue to see, there's always usually a track on local content and the importance of keeping local content. There was actually an island that was the focus a couple years ago that we're still doing things on parchment paper. So, and I actually had somebody from the Library of Congress contact me and say, well, okay, how do we continue to make sure that we're documenting all of this all the way along? So they're thinking about when we look back at how the internet evolves, how do we want to trace the process through that? There's also always usually a cybersecurity track, which is both macro and micro. Again, you're looking at the global issues of looking to protect and defend, as well as the micro issues of how you organically grow better cybersecurity habits amongst citizens and teach them. And then data protection on the other side of the privacy is always a key element of seeing how people are managing that, both from an enterprise perspective, the challenges of small business, and what they're doing. So we really try to use the forum for best practices and norms. The one thing that I think we are trying to move forward with is, once we have these dialogues, is move it out of IGF. IGF is a bit of a talk shop. It's not meant to be a decisional body, and what we want to do from there is push things to the IETF if it's something that belongs there, or push it to the forum that should have the actual next step dialogue, rather than making IGF become something that it was never initially meant to be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Shane. IGF also, if you cannot make it there, can be fully followed remotely and actively remotely with full remote participation. So I encourage you to participate. This year it will be slightly shorter than in the previous years. Already last year in Geneva it was cut by 1 day because it was happening just a week before Christmas. This year it will actually be only a 3-day event with the elimination of the day zero. One reason for that is that it will be attached to another forum, the Paris Peace Forum, if I'm not mistaken, the name which will attract more kind of heads of state representation, and the hope is that having these two events next to each other can also address a little bit the criticism that there is towards the Internet Governance Forum, that the government representation is not as strong as it should be for such a multi-stakeholder forum, because clearly it's a forum that doesn't take that many decisions. Therefore,
also noting that the Plenty Pot is happening at the same time, so we will have some people that will leave Dubai and come over to Paris, but we're not expecting as large of a crowd as we normally have, because we usually have full participation of many governments.
Correct, yeah. Usually this is a 2,000 plus meeting, so let's see what it looks like for this year. Excellent. Now, Robert, you have written a paper which is entitled "The Idealized Internet versus Internet Realities." You are working on a follow-up paper that is kind of looking into the camps in digital policy or internet governance, if you wish. How does your research fit in kind of this events overview we've covered?
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. So I guess the way that the research fits in at a high level is it provides context for what we just talked about. And one thing that I think became clear as we were sort of going down the line here is that internet governance is not one thing. Digital governance is not one thing. It's sort of, to Jovan's point there, silos have developed within internet governance. But one of the things that I found over the course of the research in that first paper, which is the one that's available here, and as I've sort of dived into the second piece of research, is that there are several sort of trends that underpin all of these happenings at the international level. The first major trend that we can see is that states are increasingly pushing to, and in many cases doing, their own thing when it comes to internet governance. In the wake of Wicked, there were sort of two primary camps and then a group of states in the middle. You had the sort of free and open internet camp that followed a multi-stakeholder model for governing the global internet, and you had the sort of sovereign and controlled camp that wanted more of a statist approach to governing the internet at the international level. Those two camps largely still exist, and there's still this group of states that exist in the middle. The difference is that the unit of analysis has kind of changed, where it used to be that we were talking about multi-stakeholder global internet governance models versus a state-driven global internet governance model. For the most part, what we're seeing is now states are diverging domestically. And what I suggest is likely to happen is states will begin to choose their own governance models, and they are beginning to choose their own governance models domestically, and those will eventually start to trickle up to the international level rather than from the international level down to the state level. One sort of, the second trend that I'm noticing, and this is particularly in the research that I'm working on right now, and the paper should be out sort of in the next month and a half or so, this piece of research is looking at these two camps, as Teresa called it. And one is sort of this sovereign and controlled group of states that's headed by the cast of characters that you'd likely expect to be in that group. You have Russia, you have China, you have most of the SCO countries, some authoritarian countries in Africa following this model. And the other is what was sort of this free, open, multi-stakeholder model for governing the internet, the architecture, cybersecurity, data protection, all of that. One thing that we're noticing in collecting some of the data for that study is that the sovereign and controlled camp seems to sort of have stood pat. They know sort of what their model looks like. They know how to implement the model, although there are variations between the way that the Russians would do it and the way the Chinese would do it and the way that the Saudis would do it, for example. Whereas there seems to be some discord in the sort of pro-free and open internet camp about how exactly you need to set up your protocols, how you need to set up your regulations, how you need to set up your legislation in order to enable the sort of internet environment that we want. What that means is that you have these countries that are pro-open internet falling on this spectrum. If you think about it, sort of a two axes in two spectrums. You have sort of content openness on one axis, and you have sort of closed and open, and then you have sort of the character of governance on another axis, and you have sort of fully statist versus sort of an equitable distribution of decision-making power. And while countries that are pro-open internet tend to sort of stay in the open side of the content openness spectrum, they tend to sort of go up and down when it comes to the statist approach versus the multi-stakeholder approach. And that's a change from 2014, where the consensus seemed to be that in order to enable an open and free internet, you needed to have a multi-stakeholder approach to governing the architecture. That leads to the third trend, and that is that security, whether it is what we traditionally think of as cybersecurity or what we think of as the more sort of Russian or Chinese approach to information security, content controls, and whatnot, has become a very real consideration for countries that have traditionally promoted an open internet. The 2016 election was the obvious eye-opening moment for the US, but this has been happening in parts of Eastern Europe and Western Europe for a long time. And what that has made some countries realize, and it's not just the information side, but it's also on the sort of data protection and network protection side, is that the state may have a bigger role to play in ensuring the security of this space, whatever it is. And what that means is that increasingly we are seeing countries set up systems that are akin to firewalls at national borders. And the operative question then becomes, well, what do those firewalls need to weed out? In the Chinese model, or to a lesser extent, because it's not really technical in Russia, the Russian model, that those firewalls would be catching political speech that is potentially destabilizing to the regime. In the British model, they're trying to sort of weed out malicious packets instead of necessarily weeding out malicious information. There are then technical questions about whether you can filter out certain traffic and not affect the information environment. The jury's sort of still out on that. But I think those sort of three overarching trends are important when we sort of talk about the developments over the next 12 to 18 months in internet governance.
Thank you, Robert. That's great. I think it's also important that you stressed a little bit this kind of national, regional, global dynamics, because we've been covering a lot, mainly the global events and the global fora, but all in all, of course, there will be those represented and pushed by their national interests. And yeah, it will be interesting to see. Would you like, any of you like to elaborate on this national, regional, global aspects? Shane, you touched upon it also slightly in when you explained the process of the national IGF feeding into the global event. Yeah. So please, Jovan.
Maybe just one comment on what Robert was outlining so clearly, and in the three trends, which is always useful to memorize, is some sort of shift from the binary view on digital politics towards some, one can call it analog coverage. And we have been noticing in the discussion, in the consultations, that views about and positions about digital policy within the countries, on the regional level, on the global level, are becoming increasingly diverse, sometimes even paradoxical. And this is one observation that summarized in this, that we may need some sort of more analog digital cooperation and digital policy for the binary world, the digital world. And the reason is very simple, because the digital is entering into daily life. The daily life of the families, individuals, countries is quite complex. It's paradoxical. It cannot be put into the nicely outlined frameworks. Therefore, that element of the messy policy or messy governance is clear in our preliminary collecting of the stories worldwide on the digital policy. Another aspect on this national, regional, global sort of mapping is that we are seeing more and more governance from edges. For example, you have the new Rwandan regulation of using drones. Therefore, you have more and more local communities trying to answer the local questions, and in a way feeding into the regional and global processes. And that is another trend that we can expect that it will be happening more and more.
Thank you, Jovan. Becky or Shane?
So ICANN was really born in the midst of this sort of disparity discussion between the sort of sovereign and control camp and the free and open camp. And I think there's always been a spectrum in the free and open camp. I think, in 1998, there was a sort of clear understanding that the internet was still very young, and there was a little bit of, well, we could pass a regulation, but what if everybody did? I think we've sort of moved away from that, and I think that that's right, and I also think it's right that cybersecurity is driving this in an enormous way. I think, as you said, internet governance is not one thing, and so placing this in is this sovereign in control or is it a multi-stakeholder model, you need to talk about which piece of internet governance you're talking about, and it may be appropriate for sovereigns to take a bigger role in some aspects and for the multi-stakeholder approach to apply in other areas where that works more. So I think it's important to to continue to think of this as not a binary, but looking at, what does the multi-stakeholder approach do well? What do we need more local or national or regional things to do? And that's a big issue for ICANN. But of course, we have always had, advocates in the room, in the government advisory committee in particular, for a much more this should be state controlled or controlled by an intergovernmental organization.
I would add to that, I think we are seeing new challenges around trust and truth as we've seen information be weaponized, which is actually a very old tactic. It's just using a new tool. So the challenge there is, can we enable real trust, which is really authentication? Can I validate where this information is coming from? Even if I don't know for sure that it's truthful, can I trust the point of where it's entering into the system? And then, I think this is where it becomes an interesting, for us it's a freedom discussion, for others it's a sovereign discussion of like, what do you do about the people that are either getting paid to send misinformation out on the system, as we are recognizing in the 2016 elections? We were a little naive. I mean, it kind of hit us upside the head. We didn't realize anybody would ever consider doing that because we're real believers in democracy. And there are a lot of people that were using the ability to sway people, and we didn't, and we weren't expecting it. So now we're a little bit on guard for it. The challenge is going to be, does this move into a more of an international discussion about, what happens when, we see government and enterprise and businesses as very separate entities. Countries like China don't. Things that we see as off the table, they don't see a table. So, we have some very interesting discussions ahead. I doubt this is going to come up well, Plentypot always gets interesting from a political perspective. That's the one that probably will, you wish it wasn't 3 weeks. If they could condense it, it would be like watching a good Senate hearing. So I think that there's going to be some, interesting dialogues in all of these forums.
Thank you. The national, fine, we've covered now. What about the regional, such as the dynamics between the European Union and the United States? This is a very, very interesting aspect. Would any of you like to touch upon
I think the most natural topic on that one right now is privacy. So obviously the GDPR has brought cookies to America, which makes me very angry. I get tired of clicking. I didn't like clicking on them whenever I visited Europe. Now I have to click on them every day, and I want them to go away. I don't think that they're adding anything. So the challenge is, I think we had you're not allowed to ask questions yet, we'll get there, is that I think it was an easy way for somebody to lawyer out of a risk assessment. It did not answer the question of privacy. So I think what we are hopefully going towards here in the United States is a discussion between data and privacy, which are separate, at least in the way we manage them. We've always managed information through why do you gather the information. The Federal Trade Commission, through the SEC, why am I gathering this information, and then what am I planning on doing it? It's not because me as an individual has information to put forward. Being a good free market girl, I look at that as a actual right that I wish people would realize and be able to monetize on. We've kind of gone inverted on that. So if we're going to change that, there's a lot of change in front of us. But we're also seeing now that California, which quite often is the major agent of change. One of the reasons why when you've had a data breach is because of the state of California. They have passed legislation which is changing the way people are tending to look at privacy, and now all of a sudden we're seeing a sea change in wanting national privacy rules. I've been a big believer that nobody knows what those click-through terms of service or terms of use are, that we need to have emojis. And I always thought it would be kind of like one of these. And now I'm thinking there should be a $, which is like we collect, we sell. Just tell me what you're doing with it, and I'll decide whether or not I want to give it to you. The problem is I probably do really want the service that's attached to it, but I call it the mattress tag of the internet. I'm just clicking through them.
Consumer reports.
Right.
Yeah. The one thing I'd add to that is the sort of interesting dynamic that a single subregion, frankly, of the globe was able to create what is, in a de facto sense, going to be global regulation. And I think that's a very interesting dynamic to track, because you hear, especially on the corporate side, a lot of folks concerned about the fragmentation of regulatory environments, especially when it comes to data protection. And here we have this race, potentially this race to the bottom in terms of sort of data protection, where if you want your data protection regulation to be meaningful, it needs to be the most meaningful, right? It needs to be potentially the most restrictive, which, if I were to pass judgment, I think is not a very great dynamic for us to be in, but is one that's definitely worth noting.
Becky?
I just want to add a couple of twists on this. So first of all, this regulatory arms race is nothing new. California has been regulating for the United States for years, and we've been dealing with European data protection regulation for 15, 20 years now as well. And I think that, it's one thing if Vermont passes a law, everybody, sort of blocks Vermont out of their, Vermont residents out. But I had a customer ask me how we were going to tell the difference between Californians and other Americans. And I said, we're not even going to try. But the truth is, it's a business non-starter to really distinguish between Americans and Europeans. So Microsoft has issued a very interesting blog that says, on a per capita and absolute basis, more Americans than any other group has taken advantage of the rights that are afforded to EEA residents under GDPR. Microsoft made a decision to make that global, and frankly, it is really hard to explain to consumers why they get certain rights if they're European and not if they're American. That's sort of a non-starter for everybody. It's my experience with respect to people using our GDPR-compliant portal that, in fact, it's more Americans than Europeans taking advantage of that. That's my experience with all of the companies with whom we interact in the advertising ecosystem. So the interesting thing is that the California law is likely to go into effect without any regulations now, because the legislature essentially, the Attorney General said, you told me to write regulations, that's fine, but you gave me no money to do it. So the California legislature said, this is just like incredible. Okay, we'll give you all of the money for the fines, from the fines, to write regulations. So essentially you have to start fining people before you have authority to write regulations. It's fabulous. And the law goes into effect on 6 months after January 1st, 2020, whether there are regulations or not. To me, we're already in a world where we're dealing with GDPR. We ought to figure out how to do something that gets the United States an adequacy determination. Otherwise, it's a kind of useless exercise. And I know that all of the big platforms and a bunch of telecom companies stood up and said, yes, we'd like global preemption. But we tried to do preemption in data breach law, and the ability to get consensus around what the data breach law should say, it never formed, and so everybody learned to live with whatever the strictest rule was, which was probably California, although there are twists and turns in every one of them. And I think, I have to say, when I look back on what we did wrong in the 1990s, not developing some kind of omnibus privacy regulation was the thing that I think turns out to have been the biggest mistake, because we just didn't play in that discussion.
Thank you. Great. Fine here.
Maybe just one comment on the different ways how data and privacy is perceived globally. We just heard about the differences between the United States and Europe, but one can also see the difference when it comes to Africa, where, for example, the major digital policy instrument convention on the African Union has in its title cybersecurity and privacy protection. And I inquired why it was the case, and one of the reasons is that the revealing of data, especially in conflict situation, in a tribal conflict situation, and could be the matter of life and death. Therefore, you have completely different context in the different regions. Asia has the more pro-market economic approach, and this is an interesting aspect in many fields, that increasingly the digital policy and is shaped by the local cultural policy context and dynamics. And data is one of the examples.
Thank you. If you allow me, I think I would turn to make it more interactive. I can collect a few, or we can take one by one. Steve, over to you first, please.
Yeah, just to go back with net choice, Jovan, I really like what you said about the UN panel.
Steve, if you could wait 1 second
Oh,
just
yes,
so we can get a
please.
microphone over for the people listening
And
online.
if you can reintroduce yourself for our online audience. Thank you, Steve.
Sure, thank you. Steve Delbianco with Net Choice, and thank you. Jovan, you said that the UN panel's charter says that it should not create new entities and organizations. Thank you for that. We don't need
Not me,
yet another.
Secretary General.
Exactly, but that's the right angle, because we don't need new entities. And Shane picked up on that. We need new ideas that have been tried someplace, and whether they can be applied and implemented in other places, which is what you said about IGF, is taking the ideas and pushing them out to places where they could be implemented. And it might be new ideas that ICANN, Becky, with respect to a new way to do consensus, or a new idea on ICANN could structure the way it does relationships with people that register domain names for purposes of who is. GDPR is a new idea that is being tested in multiple places. But along with the new ideas, we need a new framework, and maybe Robert has come closest to approaching that framework of analyzing the aspirational versus the reality. And you tried to put it on a statist versus multi-stakeholder, but there's something in between, and we've seen it here in this country. With this administration and Justice Department, while the Constitution would never allow the government to do this, this government is trying to force platforms where others express ideas to suppress bad news about the president so that good news will creep higher into search results. And that wasn't just a non-serious tweet from a non-serious president. The Justice Department met with the Attorney Generals this week and suggested using antitrust laws for that. So the fact that states are trying to lean on platforms where people usually have free expression, strikes me as a concern that I hope makes its way into your new analysis. Thank you.
Steve, thank you very much. Please, yes.
Sorry, I didn't know the rules earlier, Shane.
Okay.
But when you talked about the
Can
regional...
you introduce yourself?
Sure, Tina Iotis, a cyber strategist. You talked about the regional issues, and I think everyone immediately defaults to the privacy issue, but I think that what's happened in Europe, it goes way beyond just personal data, and it really goes to the issue of who's benefiting from monetizing any type of data, not just, and I think that that really is driving some of the antitrust issues that are going on. So I wanted to hear some comment about, after we sort out the personal data category, what's the next type of data? Because I think that all the machine learning and artificial intelligence opportunities in the future are going to depend upon lots of rich data sets, not just the personal data, but the smart buildings, the connected cities, and all of that. And I think that's the next conversation to talk about, and I just wanted to hear your perspectives on it.
Thank you, Tina. We can take one more, and then there will be another round. Please, sir.
My name's Anthony Vance. I'm with the Office of Public Affairs of the Baha'is of the United States. This question's probably more for Robert than anybody else, but certainly others are free to jump in. I wanted to ask about a very specific case at the national level, but it may apply to a number of countries. It has to do with the development of a national internet. And for example, Iran has developed a national internet that it uses to control, from what I understand. I don't read Persian, but I've talked to friends who have explained this to me, that they can actually divert information or divert searches in so that people don't get access to information the way that they could before. I'm wondering if this is a trend, if it's something addressed by the regulatory environment that you all are dealing with, whether there's any method for calling out countries with respect to this, you know, where you might see this going in the future. Not just Iran, but, you know, globally. Certainly, you know, from our perspective, 15 years ago, before the internet, there was the average Iranian citizen had one view of his average Baha'i co-citizen, but a number of factors, the most important being the access to the free flow of information has dramatically changed the the view of the average Iranian citizen towards his average Baha'i fellow citizen. So very important development for us, and I'm sure for many other minority groups around the world.
Thank you, sir. Let's turn back, because that would kind of be on the edge of my capacity. We will start with Steve, which I guess is mainly a question to Jovan. Jovan, I think this Steve kind of expressed it well. There was a lot of kind of nervousness. Is this a new body? Is this a new organization? For me, what was convincing also was to hear that this is work that is limited for a few months, that will have an outcome, a report. So how would you address these concerns of the community and the question that Steve posed?
Yep. The first, the temporary aspect is important. The time span is 9 months, and in April we will produce the report, and I think it is important also for framing of the overall exercise. This is the first point. The second point is what Secretary General clearly indicated in the mandate, that it should not replace existing fora, and it should be as creative as possible in adding the more agility, more dynamism to the existing processes, and we heard about some of them. He basically gave us the 3 criteria for success. The first one is high quality report, which obviously will be the main result. The second one is inclusive and agile process of consulting communities worldwide. Getting the stories, like story from Rwanda about very effective drone regulation, and getting the stories from local communities worldwide, getting the well-known stories from ICANN, or from how Wikipedia is basically managed. And that's the second criteria, this agile process. And third element, which is extremely important, is the capacity building through the process. It is clear that many governments and many other stakeholders are facing the challenge to grasp the overall impact on digital on society, on policy, economy. And that is the third criteria which the panel will be focusing on in the process of building capacity in the interaction. And that's the overall mandate. Therefore, few keywords is modesty and humbleness in our approach, creativity and innovation, agility and inclusivity in the overall process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to elaborate on this point? Okay, so going to the second question of Tina on what goes beyond the personal data, monetization of this data for developments really moving the world of digital policy, such as artificial intelligence. Would Becky or Shane, would you like to address this question? Because the third one will go to Robert.
Well, I mean, it's clear that there is anxiety about the size and reach of these global platforms. I think it's clear that that's not limited to Europe. I think, you know, there have been hearings on sort of a dependent, when one becomes very dominant, how do you keep others honest? I'm not sure it goes to data sets much beyond personal data, because that's where, other than the how do you keep these big platforms honest without competition, and it seems to me that's the question that regulators are struggling to look at. The antitrust paradigm doesn't quite fit. It's not. It's a very different. In some ways it's like railroads, because there's a network effect, but you can specify a gauge for a railroad, and the internet content is a little bit different, I think. So I think I don't think that we have a clear paradigm to look at it through. I think when people talk about monetization of data, they are talking about monetization of personal data, and I actually find these conversations difficult. Like, I'm just going to say, one thing that I think is going to be fascinating to see how this plays out in Europe is this notion that you have to be able to withdraw your consent for anything without suffering any negative consequences. it cannot be that the ultimate endpoint of that is you have to offer your services for free if you're a private company. And I'm sure that's not what they think and have in mind, but it is really, that's going to be tested, and it's going to be a very interesting test. So the question is, to me, the question is the value exchange, is what's going on transparent and clear, and is the value exchange adequate and meaningful, and then are there actual real protections for it? I think people don't understand the value exchange at this point. And it's not clear to me that the value exchange will stay where it is now. And based on what I'm seeing in terms of people all of a sudden understanding that they may have some right to demand that they know exactly what data you have about them or erase it, that consumers do not think that the value exchange is properly set at this point.
Thank you, Becky.
One of my
Shane?
colleagues who's from New Zealand, who's one of my colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute, wrote a great blog last week on Tech Policy Daily about, New Zealand tends to be a little bit of a petri dish because they're very social in their, aspect of looking at these things. So they try things, or they quickly abandon things because they realize that they're not going to work. And so one of them was on the idea of obfuscating people through search. And the problem was that people get tethered. So if Becky and I robbed a bank together, and then I wanted to be absolved of that and said you can't talk about it, the problem is you can still look up Becky, and I come up in the search, because there's a certain point in the search where we are now tethered together. So there's a lot of interesting algorithm questions that come up in this, as well as other items that are going to be, it's the kind of the natural way that things progressed, and we're asking for that to be unwound. I'm not sure to what end.
Thank you. Going to the third question and the development of national internet. Robert, can you kick this off?
Yeah. So Iran's not alone in doing so. Iran is sort of towards one end of the spectrum, and to your point, all of this is sort of existing on spectrums. Whether you're talking about the character of governance, it's not either you are multi-stakeholder or you are statist. That because of the number of issues, you sort of fall in the middle in some places. Iran's on one end of the spectrum, along with sort of North Korea, which is the extreme example. You could argue that China has a similar setup with their internet, especially with the way that they filter out content. It's technically set up a little bit differently. But the point is that the way that the physical architecture of the internet works and the non-physical architecture works is there are choke points that sovereigns are able to exercise control over. And what I think we're seeing is more and more as the potential liberalizing to some, destabilizing to others, potential of the internet becomes clearer and clearer. You have states around the world that are beginning to counteract that via actions that place certain restrictions on these choke points. And it all comes back to this conversation that I sort of brought up about this notion of national level firewalls, right? And there is some acceptance in liberal democratic countries that maybe we do need to do a better job, we being governments, and I'm not actually government, but that governments need to do a better job of protecting the internet in their country. The UK is a leading example. The Israelis are a leading example in this. They're doing more and more to try to filter out bad traffic. The challenge becomes, how do you balance that with the free flow of information? Because packets and traffic are information inherently. The other sort of major question there that I have is this balance between openness and security. So in most Western internet doctrine and some Eastern internet doctrine, you'll see words or synonyms of these words, and they appear everywhere. It's free, open, interoperable, secure, resilient, or something like that. What I think we didn't quite wrap our heads around when we were coming up with these 5 principles that drive, internet policy and digital policy is that there's actually some inherent tensions in some of those principles. And the ones that are most at tension, in my view, are openness and security. Open architecture implies that the architecture does not see what is traversing it, and therefore does not treat any packet differently from any other packet. That's antithetical to security. You want to be able to filter out some packets. Interoperability also potentially poses challenges to openness, or to security. Openness and freedom are, they're intertwined. There are countries around the world that recognize that. And in many ways, they began to act on that, both internationally by trying to highlight these tensions, and domestically when they began to set up their internets. And the sort of thing to watch on this front is there are 100 countries out there in the world, around the world, that are still in the sort of nascent years of setting up their network infrastructure. And the big question becomes, in these countries, which direction are we going to go? Are we going to go towards an internet that errs more on the side of openness and maybe compromises stability or security, which it doesn't have to do, right? I'm not saying that there's necessarily a binary there. Or are we going to see them err on the more sort of, for lack of a better term, conservative side, where state stability is still primary, and we need to sort of set up our internets in a way that allows us to exercise control over the stability on that internet. Yeah, it might be primal too. That was maybe a Freudian slip. Yeah. But I know that others on this panel will also have thoughts on this exact topic. So
well, all these kind of tie together with the idea that people have wanted to control information since people could speak. So, this is just a matter of where do we allow the level of control to come in, and when is it impeding on somebody else's rights? And it's a very, a lot of what the internet has done is speed up things that we were able to separate out because of time and distance, and now all of a sudden they're very front and center. I don't know, some of these places, this is more things that Jovan's working on, how do we recommend that, they tend to be more recommendations than rights on some of these areas. We'd prefer that their people were informed and they could make up their own decisions and choices, but there's a lot of governments who prefer that they don't have that information.
And it's interesting. This whole internet governance conversation, if you want to talk about it from a macro perspective, is almost a microcosm for that maybe there aren't necessarily fully universally shared rights and principles. And when it comes to different regions or different countries, there are different values placed, and that is beginning to manifest in the way that the internet is being rolled out and experienced around the world as well.
Jovan?
I don't know. There's a part of me that thinks that trying to put the free and open internet genie back in a bottle is going to fail every time. And so the question ought to be, people have been trying to manipulate other people with information since the beginning of time. And so the question is, in eras where we thought there was an appropriate balance between sort of fact and free information, or what were the conditions that led to that being the case? I have to say that on November 9th, 2016, I said I have to quit my job and become a high school teacher. Because what I think is that the only way we're going to deal with this is through educating people. I just don't think we're going to be able to put that genie back in a bottle, except if you want to, because you want to control the kind of information, and not because you want fact-based, objective information available, but because you want to manipulate people for a particular purpose.
Jovan? Sorry.
Just a quick comment on this, let's say, cognitive toolkit of whatever, digital policy, internet governance, or digital cooperation. What I've been observing for quite some time is that there are many issues where the lack of knowledge of information contributes to the simplification and this binary logic, us and them, and sort of good and bad. And it is very easy to slip into that logic, but it's very human. This is the way how we organize cognitively our reality. And if we can provide, there are a lot of possibilities of providing, and Steve mentioned the additional information, building capacity, exposing different communities to each other. What I've been noticing is that you have a cybersecurity community, which is really a focused community, which has its own language, which has its own way of shaping the problems and solutions, more or less regardless the national origins. Then you have IG community, you have emerging AI community, you have data community, and if we can help building more awareness, more knowledge, there could be a possibility for some win-win solution. But we have to be prepared for also this trade-off solution, which you indicated, Robert. And when it comes to trade-offs, one has to have as transparent process as it is possible, check and balances inbuilt into the process, and the possibility to use the New Zealand experience to revisit the attempts in the policy making. And that the question of openness and security will be quite a few areas where these delicate trade-offs will have to be found in the wider spectrum. Therefore, win-win through education, training, awareness building, exposure, building some sort of digital empathy, if I can call it this way. And then when it cannot work, then move to the really carefully designed trade-off processes.
If I could just add, I mean, when ICANN was very young, we thought that the sort of geographic and language and cultural diversity was going to be the sort of the biggest challenge. I really do think it is that vertical. The computer scientists know how to talk to each other all around the world. The intellectual property owners know how to speak to each other globally. It's that vertical diversity that is really, that's where the challenges come in.
When we have diplomats and computer scientists in the same room, I usually take example of protocol, because you have protocol in computer science and you have protocol in diplomacy as a way of organizing the exchanges. But then the perception is completely different. Therefore, my attempts to raise awareness through the simple term, which is protocol, sometimes they're successwung, but in many times they fail.
We'll go with the word governance, which doesn't exist in many languages. So,
and multi-stakeholder as well. I was taking part in the OAS's competence building measures process, and we were doing simultaneous translation, and the translator in the back was like, "This isn't a word. It's barely even a concept in our society." And so that, we got sidetracked a little bit for about an hour and a half trying to figure out the best way to actually put that in a context that made sense.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing up the question of the silos. I'm sure we can have a second round. Steve, please.
Behind you.
I have a quick question for
Yes.
the famous bank robbers, Becky and Shane. Shane, you talked about an emoji with a dollar sign that would say they're selling my data, but I would ask whether you two could draw a distinction that would have been useful in yesterday's Senate hearing.
Right.
That monetization, for sure, but almost never involves the selling of any data. Senator Tester was wigged out that he was searching for tires, and the next day he saw tire ads as he went around the web. He thinks somebody sold his data, and I believe you'll confirm there's nobody sold any data. The platforms use the fact that he searched for tires to take tire ads, direct them to his face, but the tire guys never learned who he was. So can we make a distinction between monetizing and selling data, and will that be constructive where we go forward?
Well, there's a lot of, for as many people as use and love the internet, there's still a lot of education that needs to take place on how it all works. I remember my smartest friends back in the late 90s, the first thing she said is, "How's this all free?" And I was like, but it's cool, who cares? So, I think that the fact that people are getting wigged out, they've been doing something and not realizing some level of, I hate to even use the word consequence, because I'm not sure that there's actual, depending on your point of view, right? So I think a lot of it is just transparency. I'm not sure that people's behavior will change much if they were to do something like that. And the other thing is, how long do you retain the data? That's always the question is, do I keep it a day, a week, a month, a year? The cops want you to keep it for eternity. The people who run the data centers want it to go away yesterday. So there's a lot of layers to that, and then deciding the importance to those. But I just think if we were more transparent, because there seems to, now this is front and center, just tell us, be transparent about it, and I don't think the actual human behavior will change that much. They'll just be informed if they choose to be.
Because it's a trade-off, yes.
The California law requires you essentially to have a button on your website that says, "Don't click here to tell me not to sell your data." It's just like, don't sell my data. That is that's correct. There's really, in that case, I could tell you exactly how that's working. And data is being monetized. People are advertisers are paying money to platforms and vice versa to get that information out there. There is still a lot of a lot of education to be done. But the interesting thing about that was he did not see that as a legitimate value exchange that was reasonable to him. And so I think the other thing that has to happen is advertisers and platforms have to understand. I think that there's a huge amount of self-inflicted wounds in this industry. Of just like, don't show me the same ad for, at every website I go to for the next 6 weeks, or I am a 60-plus-year-old woman. Don't show me the ad for well, yes, it was actually even worse than that. But so I think that there's a lot of self-inflicted wounds, but it is a clear indication that consumers don't think they're getting value from this, and we've got to do a better job.
None of the witnesses handled Tester's question. They all.
Well, I'd like it to go to the next level. I wanted to know that I bought those shoes at Neiman's and they can stop showing them to me. But they don't go the full size. I mean, that's where people don't catch that either, is that they don't actually know that I ever purchased those shoes.
They're trying as hard as they can.
I'd tell them. I'd say, please. They were,
I bought these.
You have to write the review for it to.
Right, there you
So
go.
there is not enough data about you available out there.
Well, eventually they'll get my credit card data and then it'll all be great.
Exactly,
Right.
to know you better. What does it look
You don't
like?
look good in that color. Don't buy that.
What does it look like on Twitter? Is there any particular dynamics worth bringing here? Okay, no. Please, more questions, comments, sharing from your involvement? Fine. Please, sir.
Hi, my name is Jack Krapansky, an affiliated former software developer. My question is about weaponization of information, because before the 2016 election, we didn't talk about that concept. We have propaganda and a lot of other stuff. But is there any efforts going on at the international levels about that? And how do you differentiate that from propaganda, or is it all the same thing? And before 2016, we were active in the U.S., a lot of elements and organizations and government agencies to agitating in other countries. How is that different from what happened in 2016?
Well, it's an element of psychological warfare, and I'll let you give the serious answer here, but because I always say, it's, I'm sorry, go ahead, I've lost my train of thought.
No problem. The international level is not the right place to be litigating or legislating on this for a number of reasons. For about a decade now, there has been a proposal sort of spearheaded by a bunch of Shanghai Cooperation Organization countries, including the likes of Russia, China, some of the Central Asian republics, for a code of conduct on information security. And that is the group that's been talking at the international level sort of most prominently about the weaponization of information. They've been concerned about it for a long time. Weaponization of information means something very, very different to them. Or it did mean something very, very different to them than it did to us. What's interesting, though, is you want to hope and think that 2016 didn't change that, but the cynic in me looks at that and says, well, the way that we view information, especially online, might be converging a little bit more than should make most people who want free expression and free flow of information comfortable. So that would just be sort of my take on saying international level is probably not the right place to do this. Sub-regional or regional works in some cases, but you want people who are coming to the table with the same sort of definition for what we're talking about in order to have progress on it, and that's a lost cause internationally.
My kind of farcical point was I was telling a friend, or I was suggesting to a friend of mine who's a spy a couple of years ago, that social media has we all know spies, has ruined his industry. And he's like, what do you mean? I said, well, all those things that you run around and collect on people that were like dossier type information, they're all on Instagram now, they're on Facebook. Like you're gonna say to some 20-year-old kid, I saw you drunk, I put that on Instagram. They're gonna be like proud of it.
Yeah.
So I think actually the part of the weaponization and the psychological warfare was clever enough to realize where to move that lever of what was people's fear point and what was an inflection point for them. Because things that used to be considered kind of like, behind the curtain, things that you wouldn't share with other people are very much out in the open now.
So if I could just Yes, but your friends, the spies, are
Yeah.
very worried about this.
Well, yeah.
And
They'd like
I
things to
think
go
that,
back behind the
you
closet.
look at the broadening of what CFIUS covers, and I think that there's a demonstrable interest in looking at, in using CFIUS to protect consumer information. I mean, talk about closing the barn door after the horses have escaped. That might be a situation, but I think that the convergence issue is, I think that national security folks are, in fact, extremely worried about the amount of consumer data that is available from a national security perspective.
Well, Shane, there is a famous paper about endangered professions, and I didn't see the spies. That could be
They'll
indicated.
find some other way to be clever, I'm sure.
But hairdressers are one of the professions which will survive the automation. Well, it doesn't apply concern me directly, but it is one of the profession with a good future. On the question of the international action, there is one small development related to lethal autonomous weapons and use of the artificial intelligence in the weaponry. The UN government group of experts concluded their work in August and adopted the principles, 10 principles for the development of lethal autonomous weapons. And it was one of the rare recent sort of space where the agreement was reached. And the artificial intelligence is probably becoming one field where some movements could happen on the international level. And these 10 principles, including the question of the ultimate human agency in the use of the weapons, and we can share that. That's one field that some developments happened on the question of weaponization.
Well, I guess just going to AI, there's been several books written and reviewed just this week about how China is obviously, they have all the big data they want that can be shared pretty easily, and they don't have privacy issues, so they're going to have a different level of the way that they're going to use AI. But I was also at an event on AI the other night with the Chertoff group, and they were talking about how there's several countries now that are not keeping the human in the loop for a kill decision with using AI and drones, and that gets to be very scary. We're going to let machines make complete full loop decisions. So that will be a whole other level, I'm sure, of international discussions to be had.
Thank you. We started this event with kind of summarizing what were some of the hot issues shaping the agenda. We looked ahead at some of the events this year. Any guesses what will kind of shake and shape the digital policy internet governance discourse in 2019? Robert?
Sure, yeah. I think we'll continue to see this trend of localization of governance. I think it started to play out, 2015, 2016, and I think it's only going to accelerate, where more and more we're going to see countries taking their own approach to how they want their internet to work. And that might lead to the dreaded F word, fragmentation. But I think that there are also, today it's hard for me to say that necessarily we have a global internet that has shared values. We have a series of connected networks, but I don't think you can can't call it a solitary single thing at this point, and I think that will continue.
Thank you, Shane.
I've said many times on panels, I don't want it to be 2020 and the internet's not cool anymore. So I feel like that's our biggest challenge for the next years to come, is keeping the good and figuring out how to manage some of what people consider bad.
Becky?
I think, in the ICANN world, we're going to be very much focused on scalability and evolution of the ICANN, in particular, multi-stakeholder model, how we make it work for the next 20 years or however long it needs to exist.
Thank you, and Giovan?
Well, in crystal ball exercise, my hope, a bit optimistic, is that interdependence that exists in online world will get more in the focus, and while the localization moves and dynamics will have definitely its go, there will be more and more people calculating what could be lost in the case of the serious fragmentation of the internet. And from grandmas connecting from their countries of origin to their grandsons, sons and daughters 1,000 kilometers away, to people who rely on the internet in their daily work. Therefore, that element of interdependence in e-commerce, in the social media use, in daily routines, gives me hope that we'll have some positive trends towards more cooperation in the digital field.
Thank you. So let's keep the global internet cool. Thank you for coming here and giving preference to talking about the internet and not watching the Kavanaugh hearing, for instance. Thank you to all of those watching us online, and keep in touch and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.